Hello, this is Brett with DevNano, and in today's lesson we are going to continue on the concept of loops. But instead of talking about a while loop like we did in the last lesson, we're going to introduce a new concept called a for loop. So I've created a new file called forloops.c, and I've imported some boilerplate code here, and I also have our while loop in here so we can start off with the concepts that we learned last time. So if you remember the syntax we said while this condition is true, loop over and over and over again. And as part of that, we had this concept of a counter that we had a count that was assigned an initial value of 0, and then we had an expression that we would check to see if it was true or false, and then we would increment a counter to continue to loop. So a for loop takes those three principles and introduces a new syntax that says for, and then we have a variable that we assign a value. So we say for, in this first section, count is assigned the value of 0. Then in the second section, we have our expression to evaluate whether it's true or false. We can say count is less than 25. And in this third section of this expression, we have an incrementing operation. So we say count plus plus. And then here we give it the curly braces and then some type of code to execute. So if I copy and paste that, this is the syntax of a for loop, and it matches really the same principles of what's happening here. So I'm going to highlight this code here, 7 through 10, and in Atom, if you haven't done this before, you can come up and hit toggle comments, and when I hit that, it will just comment out that code. So it'll allow us to have the code here, but because it's a comment, it'll actually skip it and it won't include that code. So we'll save that. Now make for loops.c, or make for loops, and we'll execute for loops to show how this works. And you see that our for loop here behaved the same way, where we printed out hello world 25 times, starting with 0, incrementing every time after the loop, and then in the context we printed hello world. So it's the same principle here of looping and using an incrementer to control how many times we loop, but a little bit of a different syntax so that you don't have to have this some of these things. It's just all built into the for loop here. So review that. I'm going to leave this lesson pretty short because the principles are the same. This syntax you just need to memorize, where you have for and then you have 3 different expressions in here. The first expression, which is assigning the variable some value. You're saying count. This is the Boolean expression here, which you're evaluating on whether or not you should continue to loop. And then you have your incrementing operation. So a lot of times you'll see just conventionally this called I. And this variable name doesn't really matter, and I'm doing this just to show you that this is just a variable name. You get to come up with the name. I tend not to like single letter variables, that's why I don't use them. But if you were to do that with the I, put that in there, run it, it does the same thing. So, and then to use an example from our last thing, if you were to say I plus equals 2, run that, you would get the incrementing by 2. So it's just shorthand for the concepts that we were talking about before. You see for loops used a lot. The way that I was taught is that generally you only use while loops if you're going to be in an infinite loop, because there are often times that you want to be in an infinite loop. But if you know how many times, if it's very concrete, how many times you're going to be looping through, use the for loop just like this, because it's designed to say, hey, this many let's increment this many times and go around. If you don't know how many times you're going to operate, that's when a while loop will come into use. So that's more convention than it is like the absolute law and science on how to do this. But make sure you understand the principles of looping. Loops exist in all programming languages. It's a very common thing, a very important thing that you're going to need to be able to do. So that's going to conclude, for now, the concept of loops, and we'll move on to some data structures in the next lesson. So have a good one.